Hello, everyone. It is 1 o'clock now, Central European time, so we should go ahead and get started. So welcome to this webinar series, zooming in on migration and asylum. This is a webinar series put together by a group of Horizon 2020 projects at MiGov, MAGIC, Traffic, and MIGNIX. Here we have joined forces to expand our collective knowledge base on some of today's most pressing dynamics, including protracted displacement, the notion of crisis in the field of migration and asylum, internal displacement, refugee-driven solutions, and alternatives to current migration governance, as well as migration and development. This series aims to facilitate evidence-based discussions and action at multiple levels. So thank you to everyone for being here with us today. And today we're going to focus specifically on the relationship between migration and development, looking at does development drive or curb migration, and specifically looking at this also for implications for policymaking. So my name is Melissa Siegel. I'll be your moderator today. I'm a professor of migration studies and the institutional lead for the MIGNIX project at Maastricht University and the United Nations University Merit. The MIGNIX project, or Aligning Migration Management and Migration Development Nexus, is a 5-year research project with the core ambition of creating new knowledge on migration, development, and policy. It involves researchers across 9 institutions in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Now today I am very excited to have a really fantastic panel with us to discuss the relationship between migration and development and also how that's working in policy and practice. We have 4 speakers today. I'm going to just quickly introduce each of them and then explain to you a little bit about how we're going to go about today, and then we'll just jump right in and get started since we have a lot of ground to cover today. So first we have Michael Clemens with us. He's the Director of Migration, Displacement, and Humanitarian Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's been very engaged in looking at the links between migration and development for many, many years, and probably many of you have had the chance to read his work in the past. Jessica Hagensanker is a Senior Research Fellow in Migration and also the institutional lead for MIGNIX at the Overseas Development Institute. Maureen Achik is the IOM representative at the African Union, and we are really pleased that she can join us today, but of course also given the current situation in Ethiopia at the moment, she will also have to leave this webinar a little bit earlier. Anna Schmidt is also a policy officer on migration and forced displacement at EuropeAid and also part of the MIGNIX end user board. Now, of course, she works for the EU, but here she'll really be reflecting on the work in her personal capacity. Now, we'll start off with short presentations from each of our panelists, followed by a moderated question and answer session where I will give them some questions to answer, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please do engage with us. Please write your questions in the chat function in Zoom, and we will make sure to get those to the panelists, and then we will wrap up. So not to take up too much of the time of that really great content, I am just going to go ahead and turn over the floor now to Michael Clemens to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now.
Great, we can see that.
Thank you, all of you, for being here, and thanks very much to MIGNIX and the co-sponsors for this this great opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to talk with you. All of us have walked through cities, I think, in relatively rich countries, countries of migrant destination, and have seen substantial numbers of people from developing countries. And talking to them, they'll tell us some of them were here for economic opportunity or a mix of motives that include economic opportunity. And the most reasonable conclusion that we could reach is, well, if there were more economic opportunity in the places that they come from, fewer of them would make that decision. I want to argue in just a few minutes here that that conclusion, as reasonable as it isn't supported by the evidence and actually holds us back from some of the benefits we could have from more innovation in policy. So I'll show you three kinds of evidence. And these are all in research papers that I'll give a link to right at the end. This first kind of evidence is across people. These are survey responses by more than 120,000 people in 24 low-income countries as defined by the World Bank. So Afghanistan is in here, Niger is in here, and 22 other countries. That orange hump in the middle is the distribution of income at the level of the household that the person responding is in, and it's lined up at 0 as the average income for everybody in that country. And that bright line is the probability that people at each level of income tell the pollster in nationally representative data, I am currently making costly final preparations to permanently emigrate from this country where I live now. That tendency doesn't decrease across the income distribution. It goes up, and it goes up by a lot. It triples between the poorest people and the richest people in all of these countries. Switching gears completely now to data at the country level. Here, the horizontal axis is the average income per capita in real dollars, purchasing power parity. So the amount that adjusted for price differences between countries. The observations here are individual countries for across the last 6 decades, and the vertical axis here is the fraction of people born in that country, and these are all developing countries on Earth, who live outside that country, who have emigrated at some point in their lives and currently live outside. That vertical line is arbitrarily drawn at a relatively economically developed developing country. That's the level of roughly the Philippines or Tunisia at $10,000 per capita purchasing power parity. And getting to that point, you can see that the tendency to be an immigrant, an emigrant, to live outside your country of birth roughly triples. That pattern, economic historians have called the emigration life cycle. And Europeans know this best of all because they actually coined that term for Europe in the years leading up to 1914. This is emigration to extra-European destinations in Hungary and Italy in the years leading up to 1914, with, again, economic historians' best estimates of income per capita in today's dollars in those countries at that time, and emigration flows outside of Europe, mostly to the New World, on the vertical axis. In Hungary, in Italy, also in Galicia, also in Scandinavia and other parts of relatively poor Europe, emigration was not something that happened when the economy collapsed or these countries descended into poverty. It's something that went hand in hand with the takeoff into modern economic growth. Now, I show these data to a lot of people around the world. They have many common reactions, all of which are completely sensible, and I want to discuss them. First of all, people ask, well, these grouping together lots of countries, is this somehow unrepresentative of the developing world? Is it mostly driven by microstates, by small islands? Is it mostly driven by south-south migration, or are we talking about flows to richer and often more distant destinations? In the individual level poll data that we started out with, if you isolate the people who say not just that they are preparing to permanently emigrate, but that they're preparing to permanently emigrate to a rich country, a high-income country as defined by the World Bank, that tendency to be more and more likely to be preparing to emigrate with income sharpens a lot. That tendency roughly doubles. So certainly in the poll data, this is not driven by south-south migration. In the country level data either. Here's the exact same graph that you saw before across countries over the last 6 decades. Now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to drop from this graph the smallest fourth of the countries on Earth. So all of the microstates and small islands are gone. And on the vertical axis, I'm going to restrict emigration to just people who have emigrated to a high income country as defined by the World Bank. And the graph now looks like this. That rise from the poorest countries to relatively rich developing countries is now 5 percentage points instead of 6 percentage points in absolute terms. So it's very similar. The relative rise from the poorest to the richest, instead of tripling, is now a factor of 10. So this is not at all a phenomenon that is limited to small sets of or migrant origin countries, or is somehow reflective of kinds of migration that are not of policy interest. Another question that comes up a lot is, well, a lot of these seem like snapshots at a moment in time. Do they reflect the path that people's lives take over time, that countries take over time? Here is a snapshot of all the countries on Earth that experienced any positive net economic growth over the last 6 decades. This is where those countries were in 2019. Again, on the vertical axis, the fraction of the country's population that has immigrated on a logarithmic scale now, but it's the same vertical axis you saw before. And the horizontal axis, again, is real income per capita for those countries at the national level. So the question is, here we are in 2019, what path did these countries take in order to get to this point? Well, if hypothetically now, the growth, the positive net economic growth that these countries had over the preceding decades had been accompanied by a falling tendency to emigrate, this is what those paths would have looked like. What the real data look like is this. These are the paths that all of those countries took in order to arrive at that snapshot moment of 2019. And you can see that the paths that they took over time are very close to the snapshot. Those white dots with the names of the countries, that's the relationship between the level of economic of income per capita and the tendency to emigrate. Those green arrows are the relationship between the growth of income per capita and the net outflow of immigrants. Those things are very similar. And in fact, they're statistically indistinguishable in the data. The snapshots are very representative of the paths that countries tend to take over time. In other words, the path that the Philippines took to become the Philippines is informative about the future paths of today's much lower income developing countries. Now, having seen all of this data, I talked to experts in this field, and it's just hard to believe for people who have direct experience with migrants. A very a brilliant and highly informed expert in Brussels once sat across from me at a table and said, "Look, Michael, I see you're sitting at a computer with these numbers, but I have talked to these migrants, and they'll tell me if I had more opportunity at home, I wouldn't have left. Do you think they're lying to me?" And of course not. They're not lying, and they're right. And these data are right. Both of them are true at the same time, and I want to explain how that's possible. It's a complexity of thinking that is so common in different fields that it actually has a name. It's called Simpson's paradox. And the best way to show you what Simpson's paradox is just to illustrate it in these data. Here are the poll data that you saw before. You saw them just for low income countries, and they were aligned so that the average income was 0. This is the data for all 99 developing countries where these data exist: low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income countries. And now the horizontal axis is the absolute level of income per adult at the household level. You can and the vertical axis again is the probability of people at each income level to tell a pollster in nationally represented data, I am currently making final costly preparations to emigrate. You can see very clearly the emigration life cycle in these data. And I'm just going to do one thing now only, and it's to split this curve into people, split this curve by education level. The green curve here is the same exact relationship just for people who have attained secondary education or more. The red curve is for people who have not attained secondary education. And you can see that within each of these groups, the immigration life cycle is either very muted or even absent. and and suddenly the relationship is much more intuitive as people have higher and higher incomes within each of these countries. They are less and less likely to migrate. But economic development is not just rising incomes for exactly these types of people. It's a shift in the composition of the population. That is, there are, as economic development proceeds, there are more and more people on that green curve and fewer people on that red curve. And that's what the white dotted line shows. It's the fraction of the population in the survey data at each income level that have secondary attainment. And as you'd expect, that rises massively with income. And you can see here, it is possible for the tendency to emigrate for a given type of person to be falling with income, even as in the aggregate, the tendency to emigrate for the whole population is rising with income. They're both true. No, nobody's lying. That's what Simpson's paradox is. Finally, these are not simple causal relationships. We're looking at a correlation between two things that combines the effect of development on emigration with the effect of emigration on development. And immigration comes back to affect development in all kinds of ways that are backed by decades of research. The effect of remittances on human capital investment and therefore long-term growth, the effect of diasporas on technology transfer and increasing complexity of the economy, subtle effects like the effect of emigration on the formation of political institutions for government accountability in migrant origin countries, which was important in Sweden 100 years ago and has been important in Morocco over the last generation or two. All of these contribute to this positive relationship that is such a strong feature of economic development that in those individual level poll data you saw at the beginning of this presentation, that positive relationship between income and the tendency to be about to emigrate from a developing country, that's present in 93 out of the 99 developing countries where these data exist. This is a very, very strong pattern, and we really need to set aside this, and I really want to stress, an extremely reasonable prima facie conclusion that immigration is somehow the antithesis of development, that immigration is something that happens when there isn't enough development or when development is not happening, and replace it with a better one, that immigration is a sign that development is happening. Immigration is something that goes hand in hand with development, or better, immigration is an opportunity unlocked by development. And I would put it in the same category as something like urbanization. The transition from a rural economy to a more specialized and more more urban economy is almost a universal feature of the development process. It's one that comes along with many, many difficulties that must be addressed by policy. It's not somehow an unmitigated good that just benefits everyone automatically without any regulation. But that doesn't mean that that it isn't a feature of development that is either harnessed by good policy to benefit as many people as possible, or if we saw our job as addressing the root causes of urbanization and stopping it to the maximum extent possible, how many opportunities would we forego to innovate in policy and better integrate slums into public services of urban areas, better educate kids who have moved into slums so that they can make the maximum contribution both to the urban areas they live in and the rural areas they come from. We would leave that all aside if we saw somehow urbanization as an antithesis of development instead of working with it. And this is what we miss when we're captured by this root causes narrative that somehow immigration is something to be stopped by development. Immigration is an opportunity unlocked by development. All of the research that I talked about here and a lot more is available right there, and I'm looking forward to discussing this with all of you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for a fascinating presentation and also for being excellent in time. I want to immediately then turn directly over to Jessica Hagensanker, who will be our next speaker.
Thank you, Melissa. Let's start by sharing my screen. Great. So thank you, Melissa, and I'm looking forward to joining this great panel now and to add a different perspective to the discussion on how development affects migration. One thing that's not obvious from this question is the level of analysis. Most frequently, this question is explored from a macro perspective, as Michael did in some of his analysis, or from the perspective of individuals or families. Again, one of Michael's graphs actually focused on the individual level. In the MIGNEX project, we complement such analysis with a focus on the local level. So briefly on MIGNEX, in MIGNEX, we want to contribute to more effective and coherent migration management through evidence-based understanding of the linkages between development and migration. And one of the questions we're looking at is how development affects migration. So does greater development lead to more or less migration, greater migration aspirations, and also what kind of migration? But before we can answer that question, we need a definition and understanding of development. Traditional approaches of development have generally focused on economic or monetary development, but migration development is increasingly seen as a multidimensional concept. So human development can consist of leading a long and healthy life, of being educated and enjoying a decent standard of living. Other relevant dimensions include political participation, safety from violence, as is reflected in the broad scope of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And of course, the various dimensions of development can follow different trends. While economic development may be improving, another dimension could be deteriorating. So in MIGNEX, we take the idea that migration is a multifaceted process of social transformation as our starting point. Development comes in multiple forms that are context-specific, can sometimes be contradictory, and that can vary widely, even within a country. So we introduced the idea of specific developments. So you can see that I've added the emphasis on the S here. And we suggest that specific developments are those developments experienced at the local level. So what are specific developments? Specific developments are societal changes that play out at a subnational level. Developments can be the result of a policy change or new intervention or broader societal changes. For instance, one development could be new opportunities for education, for instance, because a university has been opened in a city, or the education system within that town has seen improvements. Another example is that a specific area in a country could see a collapse in livelihoods. For instance, a collapse in tourism due to a deteriorated security situation or due to the closure of a mine. So in total, we consider 9 different specific developments in MIGNEX, and that includes different aspects of livelihoods, the security situation, the environment, and policy interventions. And we look at societal changes that are concrete enough to be identified so that we can measure them, and also that they're experienced, sufficiently important to be experienced by the majority of the population. We also look at developments that can be experienced as positive or negative or contradictory. They can be gradual or sudden, but are always experienced as a change over time. And they can be the result of a policy or an intervention, either entirely or partly. And in our analysis, we will look at these variations in local transformations with local level migration processes, such as levels of outmigration or the prevalence of migration intentions. And using qualitative comparative analysis, we'll then be able to draw out causal patterns between developments and migration outcomes. And this method allows us to examine how different combinations of these developments have particular effects. For instance, we may find that the expansion of local employment opportunities reduces migration aspirations in some cases, but not in others, and explains what is the difference. So our unit of analysis for much of the data collection is therefore at the research area level. So the research area can be a town, part of a city or a rural district with a population roughly between 10,000 and 100,000 people. We have 25 research areas in MIGNEX that we selected in our 10 MIGNEX countries, and we select them because they're characterized by one or more specific developments. We are currently in the process of data collection. So we started earlier this year, but then had to stop, of course, because of COVID, like everyone else. But we have started our data collection again. But I'm still going to give you one example, which is Boavistad. So this is one of our 2 research areas in Cape Verde. It's an arid and sparsely populated island, as you can see on the picture here. And Jürgen Carling was able to conduct our qualitative data collection there last March, just before all the borders were shut. And I'll now give you a flavor of some of his impressions from the field and show you what the local level perspective can add. So the key development we're looking at here is the expansion of tourism, which has quadrupled since the international airport was built in 2009. So Boavista has always seen some outmigration to other islands and abroad, but with the expansion of tourism, Boavista has become a migration destination for internal migrants and also international migrants, mainly from Senegal. So that's led to an expansion in the population, as you can see here on this chart. And the growth of the airport has totally transformed the economy. And prior to COVID, there was an abundance of relatively stable, low-skilled seasonal work. So here are some pictures of the employment opportunities that tourism provides, with people being employed as guides and drivers, but also working in the production and selling of artisanal products, and of course, in the big hotel complexes as well. So in that sense, this has been a positive development. There are, however, huge differences in how people reap the benefits from these developments. So rural areas generally benefit less or even had their livelihoods destroyed because of tourism. And this points to the importance of further disaggregation, even within a local area, which is as small as this one island of 20,000 people. Not all developments will be felt in the same way. There's also a mismatch between economic growth and social development. The growth in tourism and the expansion of the population is accompanied by rising house prices and scarcity of housing. And there's a growth of informal settlements, as is shown in this picture here. The growth has also led to increased pressures on education and health services, which have not expanded in line with the rise in demand. And this picture here shows a new school that was funded by an NGO, so not by the government. But it's just one of the few examples of a new school actually being built. And these pressures on services have to some extent countered the positive effects of livelihoods for people, showing that developments can have positive, negative, and contradictory effects. And then finally, what are some of the potential effects on migration? As I said, these are really very, very initial impressions from the field. We haven't been able to conduct our QCA analysis yet, but we have seen that the changes in livelihoods can also affect and potentially increase outmigration, for example, by changing how people feel about migration. So for example, on a practical level, Boavistans may have greater capacity for migration, for example, through personal contacts or links they made as part of their work with tourists, and also because of new skills they potentially build in tourism, for example, new language skills. I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing further in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's very interesting to see what is also the potential of this project, and we'll see much more of that also, of course, in the future. All right, so now that we have first heard from our colleagues working more from the research side, I want to turn to our colleagues who are working much more in a policy sphere. And first to Maureen Achik, also who again is the IOM representative at the African Union. The floor is yours, Maureen.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and to your colleagues at MIGNEX, and good afternoon to my fellow co-panelists. Difficult to come after those two very eloquent speakers and people who are steeped in migration and development research and have probably done it for a living for a very long time. I come at this from a very different perspective, obviously, was a migration practitioner. And perhaps this explains why I had so much problems with the question as it's framed. Does development drive or curb migration? I think for me, the framing of the question is problematic because it is possible to interpret it as intended to yield insights that are intended to curb migration, or that it is intended to yield insights to help promote development while not inadvertently producing the effect of yet more migration. I wasn't really sure how to understand the question and struggled with it, therefore. Posing the question in the way that it is posed almost seems to suggest that migration is a problem that we are seeking solutions to. And I played around with the question and wondered, again, given the perspective from which I come from it as an IOM migration official, but also as IOM's representative to the AU, and understanding how the AU thinks of migration and development issues. I wondered whether a better framing of it might not have been that does migration drive or curb development? Because how you pose the question, I think, really has greatly impacts how you then proceed to respond to it. And the other question for me was what kind of migration are we talking about? Because again, if we're talking irregular migration, the responses will be vastly different than if we're talking regular migration. It is important to underline that development, again, from my perspective as a migration practitioner, is going to be enhanced. The migration of a more desperate, more irregular sort will be driven by underdevelopment, whereas development may not necessarily lead to that same type of desperation migration, if I could refer to it as such. And then, of course, also definitions around development. What do we mean by development? Is it development in terms of the improvement at individual or household or community level, or are we looking at development in broader GDP terms? The other question that for me arises from a discussion like this is, with what presumptions is this question being posed? Is it with the presumption that migration is only south to north, or does it take account of the fact that there is also north to south migration that we should be factoring into a discussion like this one? And whose development are we talking about? Development in countries of origin, i.e. countries of the global south, or also development in countries of the global north that have tended to be disproportionately countries of destination? So whose development are we talking about here? A study comes to mind here that was conducted a few years ago by the Economist Intelligence Unit, which concluded that a world of freer movement would result in a richer world, a world that would be richer by $78 trillion US. I don't think we're talking just about south to north migration or north to south. We're talking migration in its totality. We also know from a lot of recent statistics on people who start up businesses in the developed world. Most recently, 25% of biotech companies in the US were indicated as having been started by people of immigrant stock, actually of foreign-born migrants. 25%. I think that's right there, again, is development for countries that are already considered development. It's a plus, it's a positive impact on the economy, on the economies of countries that open their doors to migrants who then go on to innovate and start businesses that, needless to say, are contributing to GDPs in those countries. But also, how do we measure development? How we measure development, as I indicated earlier, determines how we respond to this question. I will go over that again. Still along the lines of whose development are we talking about? If we look at countries of the countries of origin of this migration, it could well be a plus for them, but also a minus, depending on how we are measuring that developmental impact. Brain drain, we know, continues to be a big problem for a lot of countries whose migrants are leaving for, whose citizens rather are leaving for greener pastures. But we know that in return, a lot of those countries get huge remittances that also boost their economies. Against that background, then I wanted to organize my responses, and I promise to be brief, to the question as follows, under 3 broad points. One is that underdevelopment, I believe, is as much a driver of migration as development is a driver of migration. So again, looking at the evidence that a lot of our migration practice on the ground yields, it's very clear that people move because they come from poor countries that don't offer them opportunities that they need. So it is definite that underdevelopment is driving migration. And a few points to illustrate this. Perhaps I'll give just one example that very clearly illustrates this point, which is of a seasonal migration program from poor Pacific Islands to New Zealand. The average seasonal migrant worker earned 12,000 New Zealand dollars in any given season and sent back home 5,000 of that 12,000 New Zealand dollars. After 2 years, households with a migrant member in New Zealand had higher incomes, higher savings, nicer homes than similar households that hadn't a migrant, a member of their household as a migrant in New Zealand. I think right there you have the evidence of how underdevelopment can drive migration, but positively impact the fortunes of countries that, or communities that are sending these migrants. In Africa, we have a lot of evidence that confirms that a family with a migrant abroad generally will tend to have a slightly higher living standard. Their children will go to schools, their children will have better healthcare, they'll have a better quality roof over their head, all from the fact of having a migrant member abroad who's sending money home regularly. But in terms of whether development drives migration, yes, indeed, a lot of the research, and Michael Clemens pointed to this in his presentation. We know that a lot of the research points to the fact that there is evidence that some of the poorest parts of countries, or the very poor countries, are not always going to be the largest migrant sending countries. So there is evidence for that, without a doubt. Generally, the poor countries that are similarly situated tend to send out more migrants than less poor countries in those same regions. And here, just by way of example, Senegal, for example, will produce more migrants than Cote d'Ivoire, which is slightly, better off. Or Zimbabwe will see a lot more migrants to South Africa than will Zambia. So there is evidence of countries that are more developed having their citizens migrate less. But a lot of other factors, it's important to underline, also come into play, which explains why countries like the Central African Republic, for example, or Malawi or South Sudan, even though they're very underdeveloped, will not be important migrant-producing countries, because there's factors such as whether or not those countries have an established tradition of migration and therefore large diasporas abroad. We know that people tend to migrate towards where they already have, they know people, either family or friends. So there's other factors, it's not just development, that play a factor in determining whether or not people migrate. Second is that development does not automatically drive migration. And here we know that growing per capita income in developing countries is accompanied by higher incomes, and a lot of well-established research points to this. And yet we know that many people whose living standards improve, seek to improve their living standards by migrating, and sometimes seek those better opportunities outside of their national borders. But not everyone whose living standard improves will necessarily seek to emigrate. So I think that's an important point to underline, that people can grow wealthier while not seeking necessarily to migrate. They can grow wealthier and not move. I would also add here that IOM's extensive experience on reintegration of migrants illustrates the extent to which sustainable reintegration curbs future migration of the desperate sort. It might not curb migration altogether, but it will result in people taking less risks to try and seek better opportunities outside of their borders. Third point I would like to make is that the response is a lot more nuanced. And I think it's fair to say, and again, I think the previous speakers somewhat alluded to it, especially Michael, that development both drives and curbs migration. It does both. It's not as simple as more development, more migration, or less development, less migration. The picture is a lot more mixed. The quest for improved living standards, i.e. development, if we can agree that that is the definition of development, drives migration for sure. But migration, by contrast, leads to greater development outcomes or improved living standards. It has the potential to do so. It doesn't always do. People migrate to take advantage of opportunities that exist beyond their borders and that will pay them better than opportunities that are available locally will do. Concluding points I'd like to make, and I realize I may have gone way over my time here. I would hope that academic discourse of this sort provides policymakers with the needed insights to help them institute policies that curb migration of the irregular sort. I think, again, it's important that we make the distinction while seeking to maximize development benefits that could be harnessed from well-governed migration. I would therefore like to conclude by suggesting that perhaps a more relevant question is whether migration on balance contributes to development of both sending and destination countries. Again, going back to the point I made earlier, that whose development are we talking about? Let's not assume that rich countries don't have the possibility to get even richer from well-managed migration. And if we agree that this is the case, then migration has the potential to positively contribute if well governed, and the policy implications of a conclusion like that should be obvious. That we should be seeking to find ways to ensure that migration takes on a regular form, is protection-centered, and that it puts government at the center of matching labor supply to labor demand. And when governments are not at the center of the process, crosses, we know who is. It's the bad guys, it's the smugglers and the traffickers. I thank you very much, and I think I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Maureen, and really for a very thought-provoking reflection on the question. So I think that was really, really useful. And I know that you also have to leave soon. So of course, just step out whenever you need to. But we really appreciate you being with us for the time that you had. Thank you very much. I want to then turn the floor directly over to Anna Schmidt to get more of a policy perspective, perhaps from a European angle.
Okay, so I hope this is working and you can hear me.
Yes.
No, so my brain is just completely scrambled because there were too many things to sort of get into. I just wanted to start by I've been working now in the European Commission for about 6 years on migration and forced displacement. So I feel very ancient sometimes when it comes to this whole discussion because I've seen it from before and after the migration crisis, if you wish, quote unquote, which has really shifted this whole discussion and the way we talk about root causes and migration and development, etc. So maybe we can come back to that a little bit in the discussion because I think that's useful to know and to sort of be aware of, and it links a little bit to how much our tools drive our definition of the problem. So I often feel, especially when you're sitting in a sort of a very rich continent, right, with a lot of specific types of power, there is a problem. You define it by how far regulation or money may sort of address it, and that's a little bit what shapes every analysis. And I also think this is something that I think we discussed a little bit in the preparation of the seminar, is that while sort of theoretically maybe not very interesting, what is very interesting from a policy perspective is really to do this work of breaking down these terms, right? Migration has many different facets, different types of migrants. It includes, certainly in our sort of overall measures, it includes refugees, so forced migrants, if you wish. And it's always, I think it's a real question of how far these are included or not in these kind of broad causal stories. Development, Maureen just talked about it. Everybody sort of knows you can, if you do sort of your master's in development studies, you disaggregate it in all its forms. If you take sort of an Amartya Sen definition, expansion of human capabilities, migration itself is part of development, so it becomes sort of endogenous to that story. So I think it's you can get into that, and I've always felt when you do that in an academic setting, you basically just go, it's all more complex than that. But when you do it in a policy setting, it's incredibly important, because in the end, what we do from a policy perspective, it lands somewhere. And if it doesn't sort of link to that specific context and that specific circumstances, you sort of losing traction. And I think that's just sort of something I wanted to say in the beginning. I had these sort of 3 guiding questions when I was preparing that. How do we best measure development? Again, I already said a little bit about it, but I think basically from a practitioner perspective, at the moment, this is the SDGs. And I'm reminded when I was preparing for this, friend and colleague Oliver Bakewell sort of very much sort of 10 years ago, no, 5 years ago, I'm exaggerating, wrote a little piece about the introduction of the SDGs and the introduction of the migration topic into the SDGs. Migration and development has come home, and sort of questioning whether that's necessarily a good thing, because it positions the whole migration debate in very specific ways. And maybe it's something we can come back to, because as we measure development and then we link it to the migration, we always talk about the safe, orderly, and regular. And I think it's a question you have to ask yourself, whether safe, orderly, and regular is directly really linked to positive development outcomes, right? Michael just talked about the sort of the European migration, the transatlantic migration in 2013. There were, 2.1 million migrants from Europe coming to the US in 1 year. Was that safe, orderly, regular? Of course it wasn't. Did it have a big positive development impact? Arguably, yes, both on the receiving and on the sending countries. So just to sort of put that there. How do we measure development, and how do we measure migration's contribution to development? How do we sort of conceptualize that? Basically, we look at sort of poverty, and this links a little bit to Michael's sort of broad trajectories, but we also look at issues of pain of development, of death, of inequality, of fragility issues, right? And that links a little bit to this, how does development drive migration? It drives it through these broad structural changes, and it drives it through shocks, whether they be economic shocks, and it's a sort of the Spanish sort of economic crisis that leads to an outflow of people, or that we talk about the Syrian crisis, where you have a war and a conflict and a big shock in development, if you wish, that drives migration. So there's different ways in which development processes drive migration. And again, it's really useful to sort of understand these sort of ups and downs, even though I'm obviously, as most of us are, super impressed by the sort of the big dominant correlation that Michael described. And I think nobody questions this now. I'll get back to that in a little bit. We used to have, from a policy perspective, before 2016, basically the sort of the GAM, the European Commission Global Approach to Migration and Mobility, very much a balanced approach, you called it, right? It had all these aspects of the sort of migration development agenda. So the sort of traditional migration and development, remittances, diaspora work, trying to sort of accelerate the benefits of migration. We had a whole protection element, we had legal migration, we had irregular migration. It sort of was balanced in that way. In many ways, I think from the policy perspective, that effort at balance still exists, but politics have really attacked sort of the prioritization around that. So again, that's also something I wanted to get back to. Migration is good for development. I said migration, one of the most powerful drivers of development. I think we still recognize that. I'm not sure we really focus on it in policy terms. So that's one thing. Development drives migration. Again, I talked about the sort of the broader narrative around that. But that's very different as development policy or sort of development action can influence migration behavior. And I think that's a little bit where the controversy comes in, right? We can sort of look at this from the outside, but when we look at the policy response and how did we react by sort of understanding the sort of interaction, that's where I was very much involved in the setup of the EUTF for Africa, which tried to look at not the whole migration development nexus, but really looked at, and I think this is where the conversation hits, and I heard Maureen talk a little bit about it. The policy response, the big policy response that has happened in the last years has not focused on migration and development as such, but it is focused on irregular migration and forced displacement. Whatever the sort of political element around that, even in the root cause discussion, right? The European policy statements with some glitches, depending on sort of political circumstance, but the basic policy has always been on the root causes discussion, the root causes of irregular migration and displacement. And that's been based, and I think this is the sort of the research question that comes a little bit out of this, on an assumption that there's sort of good migration, migration that people do, labor migration, legal migration, etc. And then there is bad migration, not necessarily partially bad migration for sort of the receiving country when you can't control your borders, but migration that is driven by desperation. And that you want to sort of tackle that issue of desperation. And there's been an assumption in the policy response that irregular migration, because it's harder, because the threshold of risk is higher, must be driven by more desperation, more desperate circumstance. And then you get into this, what is that? Is that poverty? Is that sort of locked aspirations? Is that a failure of governance, et cetera, et cetera? And this is where the EU policy response, I think, has tried to lock in. different results, different outcomes, different smarts. I think that's sort of important to know. But that's been sort of on the root causes side, the issue, right? To sort of get to these pockets where you think there is migration driven from a problem. And that's been done through resilience, employment, etc., and various sort of initiatives. I think no clear impact that we see as of now, because these are long-term processes. And in each circumstance, and I think this is what the MIGNEX project probably also helps us to understand how contextual these sort of issues are. Sorry, I'm trying to rush through a whole host of things. So I wanted to sort of put out that sort of irregular thing, the issue of balancing the EUTF for Africa, which has this whole range of different engagement points in terms of policy. But what really has been the sort of controversial debate has been on the root causes. Are there specific root causes to irregular migration? I think nobody questions that there are to forced displacement, but I think this is something, and how does the sort of development story link to that? And I think this is where we're still very much discussing, whilst I think at the moment also in policy circle what Michael is saying is very much accepted, that ultimately the very broad trajectory is more economic development, more migration. But maybe that is not necessarily the policy challenge that people are facing. I think that is parked a little bit. I think in policy terms, we're looking at dealing with shocks, dealing with irregular migration, and then behind that, lurking this issue, dealing with the great transformation. What happens with these really broad structural things? And there you have all sorts of, a rise of populism based on this idea that there will be hordes coming to Europe, or all sorts of sort of broad things. But I think on the broad structural transformation issue, we haven't seen a lot of real policy engagement, and maybe the skills partnership are one part of that answer, maybe they're not. So just a couple of comments. I also wanted to sort of, as I was asked to sort of talk about the policy implications a little bit, I read Michael's, the long blog post that also explained that were just presented here. And I was just struck how the policy recommendations, however we come at it, whether it's the European Commission setting up the Migration and Asylum Pact or the Agenda on Migration, or whether it's the CGD sort of developing hardcore, I would say, real economic research on sort of migration drivers, we come to the same set of policy recommendations. They're not, there is no sort of big disagreement. Where the real disagreement comes, or the discussion comes, is on priority setting, right? We have this sort of menu of things, and then where should the effort be? And certainly in the European Union now, and this is why this is a sort of timely conversation, we are planning for the next 7-year multi-annual financial framework. This is the sort of conversation that has to be happening here. I wanted to say something else, and this is just a comment because I'm more discussant than a presenter maybe. This issue about the migrants in Europe, they're not actually the poor, and why do we think they are the poor huddled masses that are coming rather than the ones, the sort of the middle classes from poor countries. I think one is, of course, it's an important conversation, but it's an issue also of who is visible to us, maybe. And I'm just wondering how far this sort of the inverse narrative will help us in the policy conversations around integration. If we now sort of start all thinking about migrants in Europe actually being, they're actually the rich. This is, I remember sort of the British government, David Cameron at some point saying, we're not going to take asylum seekers on our borders because those are actually the well-off, right? We're just going to sort of do a very targeted resettlement program from camps in Africa. So this is just, I just wanted to put that out there. I think it's worth discussing if we really shift our lens to sort of saying this is the sort of the upper crust. What does that do politically? I know it's not a sort of a research question, but I just want, I would be interested in the reactions on that. And that's me on this. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Anna. We do have now some time for questions, and what I'll do now first is just give each of you a specific question that you can think about and give an answer to. So I'm actually not really sure if Maureen is still here or not. But maybe Anna, because we've just been talking about policy a bit already, I think I'll start with you. And what I'm wondering is if you feel like, I mean, because we have both the policy side in this webinar and the research side, do you feel that researchers communicate their work on the migration development nexus effectively? And if not, what could they do better? And then I will just go ahead and tell everyone their questions, and then I'll let each of you answer in turn. And then for Jessica, I am wondering, when we look at development interventions and development aid, there are so many different kinds of possible interventions. Do you think they generally have the intended effects that they started out with having? And do different interventions have different effects on migration decisions? And what do you think this possibly depends on? Sorry, I gave you a big question there. And for Michael, in the story that you told us in the beginning, how does time play into this story? Are we likely to see possibly different results in the short, medium, and long terms? So, Maureen, if you are there, give me a sign because I'll give you a question too. Otherwise, Anna, I think I'll turn to you first.
Yep. So just to sort of say, we have a lot of those conversations, and frankly, I came to the policy world, if you wish, from a research position. And I have been sort of, my relative ignorance has just been increasing drastically over the years, because you just lose access to and serve the conversation on a lot of things because you're unable to look. You're in a very different bubble. I felt that very clearly. And how do you increase the communication? I think these kind of events, in the end, you have to sort of pull people into a sort of a common space, right? And this is one of the things. A couple of, I don't even know, sort of time flies, but there was sort of this open letter that was sent to the Commission, you know, fund but disregards the EU relationship to research on mobility. And it was this sort of big accusation, you know, you're funding all this work. Horizon 2020, I think one of my colleagues is also here among the participants who deals with that. And then you don't actually read it, act on it, do anything. And in return, we have this issue, you don't talk to us in a very intelligible ways. Michael, I tried to read this economic paper. I'm sort of pretty highly educated. I was, you know, it took me way longer than it should have done. So I think that there's a lot of that, but I think ultimately dumbing it down is not really an option. I think ultimately it's an issue of, in policy circles, to make the space, make the time, etc., to find the conversation points. That I don't have anything big to say on. It needs to be even snappier, even shorter, even yada yada. I think this is a sort of game you cannot win in the end. You have to find the conversation so that you can ask a question and get the answer. Those kind of things. This would be my thing. I don't think there is that much. There's always an example of something very obscure and you can't understand the language, but there's also a lot of work being done for communicating. I think it's a two-way street. I don't have a good recipe. It's really about finding the time. I just wanted to say one more thing that I think is noteworthy also in terms of the policy response in 2016. The EU specifically has invested enormously on knowledge and research on this issue. And there was a very clear understanding also in the beginning of the trust fund that we don't really know. We don't know these causal stories at the macro or at the micro level. And I think you will see that over time spinning out. We're very early in this story, right? So I'm still hopeful that, you know, knowledge accumulates and spreads.
Thank you, Anna. All right, Jessica, I'll turn over to you.
Thank you. And also thank you for Anna for engaging in these conversations and sharing the knowledge in two directions. So your question was really broad, and it was about the link of between development interventions and policies and migration decisions. So I think it's pretty much impossible to answer that question in a general way. Development interventions can increase, they can reduce migration, or they can have no impact at all. And yes, they can have unintended effects sometimes and can increase migration. So for example, one example of that are skills training programs or TVET programs, which are often run as a way to reduce migration outflows, but at the same time, they also give people greater capacity to migrate and give them the skills which they need to migrate, so they can have unintended effects. The effect an intervention has really depends on the objective of the interventions, the way it's delivered and implemented and communicated, but also other factors that can affect migrant decision making. So even an intervention that's perfectly delivered as set out on paper, that reaches the right people, that is understood by the people, can still have unintended effects because other drivers of migration, for example, labor market contexts, are just so much more important. So looking at one example more specifically, social protection, just because I'm currently in the process of doing a literature review on the links between social protection and migration outcomes. We found that, for example, the way programs are designed and implemented can affect migration decisions, for example, the level of the payment or the number of payments one receives, the quality of the intervention. Then what also matters are contextual factors, as I already mentioned. For example, greater exposure to migration, for example, because the location is near the border, this was found for some Mexican studies, can still lead to greater migration despite a social protection intervention. But then there are also contextual factors that can reduce migration, for example, social norms. So that's just, a few snapshots. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, no, of course, I gave you a very complicated question that there's not a very good, clear answer to. So thank you for that, and especially for some of those examples. That was very useful. Michael, I turn over to you for the time dimension question.
Thank you so much. I just have to say I've never been a part of a richer discussion on these issues, and it's just an honor to be part of it. Yes, the time dimension matters massively. I wish Maureen could have stayed with us because she brought up, I mean, look, people migrate from Tonga to New Zealand. That was one of her examples, because Tonga is way poorer than New Zealand. Obviously, it's driven by underdevelopment, and she's absolutely right, of course. It's what you bring up, Melissa, that the question of time dimension is very, very important. If Tonga were to someday become as rich as New Zealand, or somewhere near as rich as New Zealand, very clearly there would be less pressure to migrate, and that's incredibly obvious. The thing is that for today's low-income countries, for them to become anywhere near as rich as the migrant destination countries, it's not a thing that's going to happen in our lifetimes. Hannah Postel, who's a leading younger researcher on the subject, and I wrote a paper called Deterring Migration with Foreign Aid, where we ran the numbers on this, and for truly low-income countries, Ethiopia, Niger, Mali, to enter that range of being rich enough to deter migration is something that even at very optimistic rates of economic growth is going to take more than a century, and that's just a reality. So what I'm talking about is the trajectory until we reach that point, and she's talking about a state of the world that if the world were more equal, there would be less economic migration, and both of those things are true. Maureen's not even remotely wrong about that. She was I want to just take a moment to address another distinction. Anna Schmidt's presentation was so brilliant. She started out, you started out, Anna, saying, oh, it's going to be very disorganized. And then you proceeded to give this extremely well-organized, penetrating, clear presentation. You made an important, critical distinction between formal and informal migration. The results are different for different channels of migration. Jevat Aksoy and Panu Pudvara are two of the very few researchers who have managed to get good enough data to study this phenomenon specifically for irregular migrants, and among them, people who are motivated more by employment and more by security, and they do find different patterns different patterns for those people and among those people depending on motive. So this is a very nuanced story. I do want to point out that the extension of the root causes narrative to migration in general is it's too broad a phenomenon. I understand completely that you understand this, and that many and that the best people working on this understand it, but it's not just glitches of Priti Patel gives a speech or Sebastian Kurz gives a speech where they extend root causes to all migration. It's also more fundamentally the fact that the major movement to deter migration with foreign aid, and very explicitly from Europe and absolutely from the United States as well, has not been accompanied by an expansion of formal pathways for migration. So I think it's very reasonable that people would look at that behavior of massive support for deterring migration at the same time as not as in the EU Migration Pact, it's still entirely hypothetical what these formal pathways are going to be and how large they're going to be. I think a reasonable conclusion people could arrive at is that it's very much open to doubt whether the root causes narrative as it affects policy is going to be focused on irregular migration, or is something that extends to migration in general, and that includes aid programming. The EU Trust Fund is a fantastic thing and is doing all kinds of good across the continent, completely separate from deterring migration or not deterring migration. It's just doing lots of valuable things. But extremely little of that aid programming is for fostering formal migration of any kind, or channeling migration from informal to formal channels. A group of journalists calculated for Nigeria specifically how much of Nigerian aid is dedicated, that is related to migration in some explicit way, is dedicated fundamentally to deterring it versus fundamentally to establishing lawful pathways. And the balance was 99% for deterring it, and less than 1% for explicitly fostering formal movement. And looking at that reality, one could question whether the root causes narrative that Marina Cheng specifically and incredibly politely said, her exact words were, "It almost seems to suggest that migration is a problem." That's the most diplomatic way one could possibly say it. Whether that it has extended certainly in the public's mind and in the realized in the reality of policy as we have seen it to date, whether it extends to all migration. You, Anna, point us toward, I think, a much better and more constructive future in which that policy actions of that kind are in fact focused on irregular migration, and that focus requires the hard work of building formal channels, and that's something that certainly in the United States and Europe is very much a work in progress, or maybe even a work that is beginning. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that intervention. All right, I'm going to try to take some questions now from the audience, our very extensive audience here. So the first question I have is for Michael. The first point is, for instance, in a lot of the work that you looked at now, GDP is still being used as a measurement of development, or GDP growth, and how useful is that, and should development in this way, in a macro way, continue to be looked at with GDP, or is would another measure be more useful here? Then additionally, how do levels of inequality in the countries of origin play into outcomes and into results in terms of creating different incentives for people at different points in the income distribution, and also in terms of the interaction with education? Are the educated in countries with higher inequalities more or less likely to migrate, for instance? So I'll leave that first with you, Michael.
Thank you so much. These are such smart questions. So on measuring development with GDP per capita, which economists tend to do maniacally, Hannah Postel and I wrote this paper called Deterring Migration with Foreign Aid, where we show some of the data for other measures of development. So I don't want to take this time to share my screen and put up a picture, but if you just look at the relationship between the tendency to emigrate from developing countries and child survival. So this is the probability that a person born in each country, born alive in each country, makes it to age 5 without dying. It is a very strong positive relationship. That is, countries where children are less likely to survive to age 5 have lower rates of immigration than countries that have much higher rates of child survival. Those have much higher rates of immigration. And obviously that doesn't mean that people prefer to stay in places where their children are less likely to survive and prefer to leave places where children are more likely to survive. That has nothing to do with it. This is not an individual level choice that's being mapped out here. Development from a country that can save that is not able to save children to a country that is more able to save children is this incredibly complex structural shift that involves all kinds of things: higher education, a better and better health system, often more and more urbanization, more and more incomes so that people are able to access health services. All of these things that I just mentioned complement child survival, and they complement immigration, and that is why we see this positive relationship. So it's certainly not something. These patterns at the 30,000-foot level that we're talking about are certainly not confined to just economic development. Inequality. So I have a paper called "Does Development Reduce Migration?" where I review 45 years of literature from anthropology, sociology, geography, and economics on this subject. And economists have not looked carefully into the relationship between inequality and immigration. Other disciplines have, and the general finding there is that rising inequality with development in some countries has been an important mechanism for this generally positive relationship between economic development and migration. And I think the questioner alluded to exactly why that is. And maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. All right, I will turn my next question to Jessica. And the question here actually says that in what Maureen was discussing, she said that people can grow wealthier and not move. This seems quite obvious, and in the sense that the majority of people don't move even after increased development. Yet it's something that we often miss in our research and policy debates on migration in Europe, more specifically. We're more focused on and biased on the mobility and migration. What can we do to improve the discussion and balance starting from the research world? And do you think this is an important thing to do? And what are the consequences of not doing it?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, and yeah, definitely one I can relate to. So what Maureen talked about, and also what the question says, the majority of people, of course, don't move, partly because they don't have the capacity to move. They're not able to afford to migrate. They don't have the channels, but then even more importantly, because the vast majority of people don't want to move, so they don't have the aspirations to move. So it's really important that in the migration research we do, we look at not just the reasons why people want to move, but we also look at the reasons why people want to stay. So we always look at both sides of that coin, and that's definitely something we're also going to be doing in the MigNext projects. We're just as interested in the drivers of immobility as the drivers of mobility. So I think that the first way researchers can contribute to that misconception is by doing the research and also showing the drivers of immobility. I think the second way is maybe potentially through language. So I think by being so fixated on the term migrants, it's I think that's certainly not helping, because migrants, and I'm as guilty of that as everyone else, and migrants has this kind of very binary association. So someone's either a migrant or they're not. And once they start thinking about migration or considering it, they fall into that migrant category. But I think what really happens in people's lives is that it's much more fluid, and at one point they think about it, or maybe they don't, and they might move internally or not. So it's much more kind of a mobility patterns we're seeing, which are really fluid, and it's not one binary state, but something that kind of changes over time and can go up and down. So I think by not describing migration in such black and white terms, and by talking about immobility and seeing that continuum, we can also help to nuance the discussion.
Thank you for that, Jessica. I want to actually now turn to a more policy-related question. This one is for Anna, and as has already been discussed here, for instance, a lot of the policy discussions, there's this kind of vague idea around more legal pathways for migration, but we're very seldomly actually seeing this. But it's clear that there's both a definite supply and demand for that labor. So how can we bring this down to a pragmatic level of matching supply and demand, with both sending and receiving countries being candid and intentional on practical partnerships? So things like seasonal work, and have perhaps also more turnover of this. And what is the role of local policymaking also here? And what can policymakers do better to help support these things?
Yeah. On the legal pathways, I mean, I said earlier a little bit about, you respond with the tools you have. I sit in DEFCO. There is no way from a development cooperation perspective, certainly when it comes to sort of migration into Europe, that there's much that can be done on legal pathways, because that is just not within the policy realm that you have at your disposal. Right? That is a decision of member states. It's a very difficult political decision. There is funding to some of these sort of labor migration schemes, but the ultimate decision of entry and exit into territory, the visa issues that are behind all of this, they're taken by member states. And there are two issues around that. One is that that's a prerogative that is quite, that's a real thing that you also don't want to give away beyond sort of whether you actually want to do something or not do something. I think that there is that issue at stake. And then there is the issue of sort of options. I think what is clear at the moment, and also in the conversation, of course, between the EU and the AU, and in all of these dialogues, is that legal pathways is absolutely an important part of the agenda, but that preferences on sort of moving forward on this are very different. And so this then becomes part of a negotiation, like a very classic negotiation. You give me some sweets, I give you some bread, whatever. It's like this sort of issue around this. And then there is this now sort of, I mean, just this morning, there was a sort of internal seminar on skills partnerships and labor migration and what can be done on that. I think that's hugely important, and any sort of successful pilot helps shift that conversation, because it has to be an integral part. I think everybody is clear. Where I personally sometimes wonder is we don't actually, and again, you never know what is cause and what is consequence, but most legal migration to Europe at the moment is family reunification. Is that because there isn't enough labor migration opportunities, or is that because that's not the type of migration that happens at the moment? I think it's not really clear. So there's a little bit of that conversation. I wanted to say something just to come back. So that's it on legal pathway. I think that's an absolute, it's now sort of understood as a major issue. I think especially the Commissioner Johansson has been very clear on this. This is supposed to be a part and parcel, a bigger part and parcel of future work. Caveat, this is member state issues. Caveat, it will be these sort of labor migration pilots, they're very small in numbers, right? Even successful ones, they're very small amount of people are done. The political basis for this kind of work is shaky, and that lies in demagogy in popular, but it also lies in sort of the fact of how integration works in European countries. So I'm talking specifically about legal pathways in and out of Europe, right? So I think there, the sort of the discussion on what options you have and what you don't stands and falls with the sort of conversation around how inclusion and integration works in European societies. If that works well, there's more of an opening for legal pathways. The more problems are felt to be there or are actually there, and it's both, the more difficult that gets. I wanted to say something very, very quickly on the trust fund, and not because there was also a question in the chat on sort of why do we invest so much on a development approach and this sort of resilience approach if we don't know it works. We don't know how much it works on migration, but we know that it's important to people who are in very fragile situations. So I think there's part of that is that, right? It's a sort of also a little bit of a do no harm approach, if you wish, in a positive light. You do that, you hope it works, you sort of learn while you're doing it to sort of see what works and what doesn't work and adjust that. And I would like to also point people to a report that is coming out, sort of lessons learned from the trust fund by Altai, who have done sort of, I think, some great work on sort of summarizing a little bit our experience and some of the lessons learned from the trust fund. And of course, there's an official evaluation coming out. Just to correct the amount of money thrown at various root causes conversations under the trust fund, there was about 50% of the total 5 billion were spent on migration. The rest was pure resilience and stabilization money. And of those 51%, around 34% were spent on forced displacement. So helping host countries, helping displaced communities, IDPs and refugees. And then of those 51%, again, 16% were spent on return and reintegration, which is still an awful lot of money, but it's a slightly different, just to put that into perspective. That's it.
All right, thank you so much to everyone for this really, really enriching and engaging discussion. Thank you to Michael, Jessica, Anna, and of course Maureen for being here, and of course to our audience for being so engaged. It was great to see the chat lighting up constantly. So I'm sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions. Of course, we have limited time. If you also had to miss part of the conversation, or you know other people that would be interested in this, I just want to remind you that we have recorded this session and it will be available on YouTube. So please go back and have a look at this and share it with your friends, colleagues, others that you think it could be very useful for. I also just want to draw to your attention that this is not the end of this very engaging series. The series will continue in December, on December 15th at the same time, starting at 1 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Central European time. And there, the Traffic Project will be hosting it. And the title of the next one is Refugee-Driven Responses to Displacement. The series will also continue in the new year, which is great news. We will have the next session also organized by the ADME-Gov project in January, looking at labor migrants and their contractual and working conditions during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that will be on the 26th of January at the same time. Of course, you can check out the website if you have any other questions and you want to keep up to date with what we're doing. Again, thank you to everyone for being here. Also on behalf of the MIGNEX project that was organizing also this session, I think that this is really given us a lot of food for thought and plenty of ideas for new research also, which we will try very hard to make sure that we communicate and engage with policymakers and practitioners on all of these topics. So thank you again for everyone for being here, and we will see you next time.